Amazing. So, as I said, if you've been involved with animal rebellion for a while, you've probably come to a presentation like this before, where we talk about how we can use the learnings that we have, as well as messaging communications theory, to work, like build our messaging and develop really kind of like powerful ways of communicating. So tonight we'll be talking about the 2022 messaging guide. So this builds and expands on what the work we did in 2021. It takes learnings that we developed through consultation, as well as through actions. And it also, we decided with this guide that one thing that we really wanted to focus on is including more kind of practical resources. So things that people can use, from kind of facts and figures to very like functional copy that people can just grab and use in things like social media, spokespeople, interview prep, and things like that. So hopefully this version of the messaging guide is updated, more practical, more useful. And today we're going to be walking through what it is and how you can use it. So I'm joined by some others from the messaging team as well. So I'll just introduce them. So I'll be co-presenting with Adam, give a wave, and Nathan will also be walking us through some of the guide. I'm also joined by Joe and Alice, who have been working on the guide as well and are part of the messaging team. And there's also a couple of other members of the messaging team who have worked on this who couldn't be here today, but are sending their love. And we'll talk a little bit about the UK messaging team as well, and just so you can understand kind of what we're trying to do with creating this. So to get started, we're going to go over a little bit about why messaging is so important and why we put so much energy into developing these guides and running these workshops, and trying to get everyone united behind the message. And for that, I'll pass over to Adam.
Yeah, hi guys, hope you can hear me okay. Yeah, so this is some back to basics stuff really. You can see it's on the slide. It is all different social movements of one kind or another. I'm sure you know where they've come from. And yeah, they're all sort of united by these really strong messages that manage to unite all sorts of different people around one idea, essentially, which yeah, is communicated really intensely. And yeah, so it's from these sorts of movements that we can learn how to make really good messages, and we can evoke the sorts of stories and narratives that connect with the sorts of people we need to. And you might say, why are stories important? Narratives. But yeah, on the next slide we have a little exercise. If it ticks over. Yeah, so this is just a video, and you have a watch and see if you can work out what's going on. Yeah, I think it's about 90 seconds or 2 minutes. So yeah, give it a go, see what you think. Yeah, I hope you're all able to see that. Basically, yeah, that was part of an experiment from back in the 40s, the Haida-Simmel experiment. And if we turn to the next slide, you may have had an idea of what was going on. We've done this before, and people often thought the same as these tweets. And yeah, what's really interesting is we find there's a huge range of interpretation that we get from these very simple shapes. People interpret motivation and emotion, and yeah, complex meaning out of yeah, just small shapes on a screen, which is good. Obviously, it tells us something, and that thing is it's really hard to communicate a message, essentially. So when, as communicators, we want to create this impetus in someone, it's very hard because yeah, our thoughts are structured through stories and narratives, and it's really hard to know what to say that's going to be received in the way you intend. And there's a really good example of this on the next slide. There was Jamie Oliver tried a campaign, I think back in the mid 2000s, talking about sort of the sugar in food and how manufacturers are being irresponsible and how it's awful and they should, you know, crack down on sugar in chocolate, that sort of thing. But yeah, it easily backfired upon irresponsible parents. So it's very hard to know when you're creating a message what the implications of that are going to be. And if we want to do it right, which we try and do in messaging, we have to think, yeah, not just about what we're saying, but you know, how it's going to be received. Yeah, so there you go. That's the lowdown on why we deal with stories. Yeah, and then up next, messaging team. So what do we actually do when we're trying to create stories? So yeah, the first thing is we, as is now obvious, we need a core and common narrative that sort of unites everything we do. Otherwise, you know, we'll end up like poor Jamie Oliver and be barking at the wrong tree. Yeah, so we do the internal and external messaging, and then yeah, you can see all the things that entails. So we do research and do trainings like this one, guides like the one this is for, and yeah, we try and maintain that sort of balance within the organization, which again you'll see on the next slide, which is obviously, you may say that, you know, the organization is decentralized. How does that work? Surely the messaging can't be. And yeah, of course, it's great that we're decentralized, but we do need some sort of rigidity that balances out the very, very flexible way of organizing we have. And obviously saying one thing 100 times is far better than saying all of us saying a different thing 100 times. So yeah, consistency is really, really important. And that's a core part of our mandate.
Amazing.
So yeah, I think it's over to you, Harley.
Yeah, so an example of this, another example of this idea that, you know, we, rather than saying one thing 100 times, we want to be saying one thing 100 times, is the Irish Together for Yes campaign. So this came up in 2018 and before, in the lead up to the referendum on abortion rights in Ireland. And obviously kind of like leading into this campaign, as many of you would know, there was this incredibly divided, confused message, which had come from many years of campaigning on both sides, either to ban abortions or to kind of legalize them. So what the campaigners realized very early on was that they were kind of coming up against a lot of confusion and a lot of kind of different points of view and different perspectives, and that they were never going to really convince people to all think the same way. They were never going to convince people to all agree on one thing or disagree on one thing. It was always going to be very divided and very kind of jumbled up. So what they realized instead was that campaigners kind of who were trying to kind of move towards this, like people voting yes on this referendum, was they needed to bring people together behind a narrative they could all agree on. So rather than kind of dividing things up by, you know, everyone saying, you know, the reasons that their specific group thinks that they should, like, people should be voting this way, they united people behind this very kind of centralized message of care, compassion, and community. And you can see kind of in some of these examples of how, you know, different people involved in this campaign really kind of kept up this consistency with this messaging. So I think this is a really fantastic example of this idea of having this really decentralized movement. There were so many different groups who were part of this campaign, but uniting behind this shared narrative, this shared idea of coming together for these, the care, compassion, community, and just repeating these over and over again. And I think something that I like to think about is it's kind of a golden rule in like advertising and things like that, is that, you know, about the 1000th time that you've heard your message or what you're trying to communicate, by the time that you're sick of it and you think, you know, you never want to hear it again, that's the first time that the person you're trying to reach is hearing it. And I think it's a really good rule for what we're trying to do as well. Like, even though we're not selling a product, we're essentially trying to get people to get on board with an idea. And sometimes it can be tempting to, you know, always be thinking about, oh yeah, we used that slogan in the last banner, or we said that in our last social media post. And I think it's important to remember that we can never assume that our audience, the people we're trying to reach, have the knowledge that we want them to have. We should be always anticipating that they're not where we want them to be yet. They don't have the information that we need them to have yet. So we need to keep kind of reinforcing the same message and reinforcing this framework. And this kind of goes back to communications theory as well, of that people have these multiple conflicting stories in their heads. And the more that we can reinforce a story that we want people to be kind of thinking and getting behind, the more people are going to think in that way. So this is something that, I guess, all together is like why we talk so much about messaging and why we think it's so important, and why it's so important that as a movement, we can kind of unite and come together behind some of these messages. So moving on, what we learned in 2021. So 2021 was a big year, as everyone knows, and it was a big year for Animal Rebellion. It was a big year for, you know, many other movements kind of across the country and across the world. And it was a year that we learned a lot about what's working in our messaging, as well as what we can do better. So we learned this through a bunch of different ways. So I guess number one is through experience, through actions, through what was getting press, what wasn't getting press, how the media was reporting on our messaging, and also just through kind of like actions are a great source of innovation and inspiration, of how, you know, there's people who uniting behind a common goal of, you know, making something happen and causing a real impact. And that's where a lot of great ideas come up. So, you know, I think one thing that Public Interest Research Centre, which I'm going to talk about next, told us in the consultation we did with them was that, you know, you can only get so far with sitting behind closed doors and even doing things like focus groups and things like that, because a lot of the best work that you're going to do is going to come from being on the ground and coming up with things and innovating. So on that, we also did a consultation with PIRC, so the Public Interest Research Centre. They're a messaging kind of consultation group who specifically focus on social change. They've done a lot of great, amazing work on messaging around race and class, as well as the environment, with their work on framing climate justice. So we did some work with them on thinking about what is working in our messaging and any recommendations they have. And then alongside that, we also engaged in consultation. So this was consultation with people within Animal Rebellion, as well as people kind of outside of Animal Rebellion, and understanding what was really kind of hitting people and like what was affecting people about our messaging and what maybe wasn't so much. And from that, we learned a couple of things. So some of the key things that we learned was that our message is cutting through. We saw in 2021 more kind of uptake in the press than we have since we were founded. And with that, more consistent uptake in the press as well. So more kind of messaging that is was consistent with what we were trying to say. We also learned that we're competing with feel-good solutions. So a big kind of story that's being told in the society right now is that, you know, you don't need to stop eating animals. You don't need to stop eating meat and dairy. You can just eat better quality, less and less. And what this is, it's to really kind of like feel good, reassuring story for people who are worried about the future, but also don't really want to change what they're doing. So we know that in order to compete with things like that, we need to develop our own vision and our own kind of irresistible vision of a future which everyone can feel like that's something that they want. Another thing that we learned is that, you know, we have to go big or go home. And yeah, I think we learned this with actions, but it also applies to messaging, that one of our kind of milestones in Animal Rebellion is to like shift the Overton window. And what that means is to kind of change what is acceptable and what is kind of seen as status quo and common sense. So we want to make it irrefutable that, you know, if we're going to address the climate crisis, we have to address and transition our food system. So we can't do this by tempering or watering down our message. We need to be pushing this message, and we need to keep building on that. And then we also learned, and I touched on this before, is that we need a clear vision. We need something that people can say yes to, and something that people can kind of feel like they can get on board with, rather than just focusing on what we're against. And we also developed some top tips, and I'm going to pass over to Adam to talk through these.
Yeah, cheers. Yeah, so these are our very selective top tips. I'm not sure where I came up with them, but they all seem to work. Yeah, so successful messaging is a bit sort of Goldilocks and the Three Bears, and that really pertains to the first one, hope-based communication. So when we you know, pour all of our bits into a a slogan or a tweet or whatever, we like to make sure we have the right sort of mixture of problem, obviously we know there are problems, and then also hope. So we like to say 1 part problem to 2 parts hope, just to make sure we're on the right side of that balance. And we know that's really powerful for creating sort of sustained action. Yeah, if you're too doom and gloom, you turn people into zombie apocalypse mode and they run home and sort of start counting tins, and yeah, it doesn't work. Yeah, so we always say go for hope-based communication, lead with those sort of shared values, and yeah, get people really inspired and fired up. And yeah, everyone wants the plant-based food system, so you know, we've got to put it out there, and then yeah, make sure it's going. And obviously with that comes sort of hedging. So that's really in terms of language. Anything that sort of casts doubt or uncertainty over your message. So saying things like, you know, verbs like may or might or can, or things, you know, maybe, probably, possibly. We tend not to include that sort of thing. We like to be very definitive, to make sure our messages are clear cut. You know, we're not might gonna shut down McDonald's by 2025 when they transition to a plant-based food system. Their menu maybe, could be, possibly. It's all hedgy. So yeah, we leave that out. Elephants. We've recently been told that we might have a problem with the elephant image for something speciesist, but that's by the by. For now, we call elephants the sort of the words and arguments that are used by our opponents in the narrative. so it's people with whom we don't really overlap, whether that's people who would advocate for individual change, or whether it's more sort of fundamental anti-climate science stuff. We don't get involved in it. People tend to remember the things you talk about, even if you have sort of knots, and we don't think that's right. So yeah, we don't engage with opposition argument. We just present what we have. And then the final one is avoiding othering. We think that's really good. We don't like to speak sort of on behalf of people. And obviously, othering is a process that sort of creates minorities. And we really don't want to be, speaking on behalf of victims. We want to sort of empower and tell stories of resistance and strength in the face of adversity. Yeah, so there are our top sort of 4 messaging tips, which leads us on to, the real business, the new messaging guide, which has taken us quite a long time to do, and it's an update on last year's one. And yeah, it's in or coming to all group chats near you, so it should be very available. And yeah, we'd like everyone to read it. Obviously, it's more pertinent to some people's work than others, but yeah, I think Harley's going to run through some of the important aspects of it.
Yeah, thank you. So I'll go through some things pretty quickly, because hopefully you'll all read the guide after this, so we don't want to bore you going through it all. But essentially what I'll be doing is kind of going through just quickly kind of like what the different sections are in the guide and kind of what they can be used for. And then we'll be talking a bit more about like how to use those in like staying on message. So to start off, we start with our core messages. So these are things that we've used in the past and that kind of form the basis of our kind of key core stories, Animal Rebellion. So we have things like our central narrative of animal and climate justice, our problem narrative, meat and dairy, kind of climate crisis and animal agriculture. We have things like our solution story, plant-based just and sustainable plant-based food system, ending animal farming and kid fishing, and our central stories as well. And we also have things like slogans, and these are always being updated and changed. I would add a few more to that now. But these are kind of like the basic things that we will repeat over and over again, and they form the basis of these core messages that we're trying to embed. And I think plant-based food system is a really great example of that, how that's been kind of a key message for Animal Rebellion since the start, and it really kind of follows that story that we talked about earlier of how you have to be like using these messages and getting them out there and repeating them for them to have meaning in people's minds. Because at the start, if you say plant-based food system and it's not connected to anything, it's not attached to a story. Whereas if we keep using it in conjunction with this idea of climate justice and animal justice and kind of protecting the planet and taking action, like that starts to all be linked together. What we also include in the guide is a new updated frame. So as if some of you probably know, the Animal Rebellion frame is kind of how we go about messaging. So what we include inside our messaging and what we choose not to include. So there's so many things, inside and outside this frame. And I think I've highlighted a couple of things that are new updates or really key things. So one thing that we are really kind of like highlighting this year and trying to focus on is this idea of emphasizing the effortless justice angle of the simplicity message. So kind of like, and this goes back to going up against these feel-good solutions with a vision of our own that people can say yes to without it feeling like hard work. Other things are this idea of being kind of like cutting edge and on the edge of a bigger movement. So making people feel like they're part of something. And also highlighting that all animal farming and fishing needs to end. So again, like what we said earlier, pushing this go big or go home kind of thing. On the outside, we have things like, animals being victims, so being powerless or voiceless. And we try and talk about animals as individuals and as kind of as us being allies to them in this struggle. Also emphasizing on the outside are things like, you know, this regenerative agriculture, organic, humane kind of story, which is very common. But I guess emphasizing that we're trying to push a much kind of like more, yeah, I guess like a fully plant-based food system is what we need and the only kind of answer to this problem. Also including on the outside coercion, force, and manipulation, to make it clear that, you know, while we're pushing for a solution, we're also pushing for that in the way that we're trying to build something together, and having this kind of ethos of care and compassion, which is inside the frame. Another thing is kind of this all forget about the science, individual hedonism kind of messaging, which is very, I guess, like, oh yeah, the world's going to end. We can all just kind of like kick up our heels, and focusing instead on this idea of like, we need to come together and together we can make change, which also ties into another thing that's been outside of our messaging for a while, which is emergency doom-based messaging. And this is something that's really interesting because avoiding like this doomism is also balanced with making sure we bring in the urgency and make people feel like this is something that has to happen now, but without kind of getting people to lose hope. So it's kind of a careful balancing act. I guess some key parts of this frame are system change, climate and animal justice, and that people can make change. And there's more about all of those here if you want to read about them later. And I guess like what this looks like in action is something like if we use the recent action at DEFRA as an example. So if you think about the frame, if you think about this in like how this might look in person, you know, you have this message of COP26, invest in a plant-based food system. And this is, you know, tying into this idea of vanguardism, cutting edge of that we're on the Home Office building, kind of shouting this message out. It's also tying into this idea of system change. We're saying invest in a plant-based food system. And it's tying into the idea that we have hope. We still believe change can happen. And what's left out of this frame are things like doom. You know, we're all screwed. The world's ending. Run for the hills. Also things like individual change. And as we always say, you know, individual change has a really important role to play, but it's not the role that Animal Rebellion plays. And also blame. So, you know, kind of talking about individuals or groups as being selfish or like shameful, things like that. Instead, we're showing belief that we believe that they can make the changes that are needed. And this balaclava is meant to represent kind of violence and aggression, but you know, balaclava is also just what you wear when you're cold, but I couldn't think of anything else. So apologies if I've offended any balaclava wearers in the building. Moving on, we also have some advice in the guide on say this, not that. So these are just kind of suggestions based on the feedback that we've been given, what's worked, what hasn't, and our consultation work. So things like saying meat and dairy and fishing rather than saying animal farming. This was something we learned from Perk, in that farming is what's known as a robin, which means that it's a word that comes just attached to positive connotations. If you say farming to someone, most people will think very positive things. So it's then hard to get them to think along the lines of this is something that needs to change or even end. So being very explicit and specific and saying meat, dairy, fishing, these are things that kind of aren't as attached to these. Also, yeah, saying things that we've talked about, like shared before about saying we say Animal Rebellion, we don't try and abbreviate because of just collaboration work. Say plant-based food system because system change, animal and climate justice because we want to have messaging that's rooted in justice rather than rights, which are administered by the state. And we also say plant-based future and plant-based food system, and that's because we want to kind of have this consistent messaging rather than kind of constantly changing what we might say. With one day we're saying a plant-based food system, then the other day we're saying vegan food system or veganic or things like that. We want to have this consistency of phrase. And with that, I'm going to pass over to Nathan, who's going to walk us through the next couple of sections in the guide. So take it away, Nathan.
Cool. I hope everyone can hear me. Yeah, so the next section is what we call stats that tell a story. It's acknowledging that people have their frames and just chucking facts at them is unlikely to change their opinion. I'm sure we're all aware of the meat paradox, where a lot of the time where you tell people that eat meat, the facts about it, they actually double down on those beliefs. So it's about acknowledging statistics are important, but we need to present them in a way that people understand and can fit into their frame. So, for example, the first one is the industries like meat, fish, and dairy contribute between 18 and 23% of all greenhouse gases. So just chucking out someone might not be as effective as explaining to them that a just and sustainable plant-based food system is what we need to tackle the worst effects of climate breakdown, because most people have the climate crisis and climate breakdown in their frame already, and they want to do something about it. So yeah, this part of the messaging guide is about translating statistics into stories that actually people are going to understand and get on side with. And yeah, that's kind of this section of the messaging guide, if you move on. So yeah, basically this is kind of an example of that from the DEFRA action. So as you can see, we use statistics in here, but we're not just using them in the abstract, we're actually explaining a story that those statistics support. So as you can see, defund meat and subsidizing a just and sustainable plant-based food system is the story that we're pushing, but the statistics that back that up are the kind of Amazon deforestation, again, the greenhouse gas emissions, and the fact that the government invests so much money in this unsustainable food system when we have this future that is sustainable, and talking about it in that way fits in with people's frames. Is this, I think this was Joe that did this section.
You can take it if you want, Joe, or I can jump in. It all blurs together. Basically, the premise of this section is that we realize that, you know, sometimes there can be so many things that people say, and I think many people will have had this experience that it's, you know, the arguments that people come up with can be so familiar. So we wanted to kind of pull together a resource that allowed people to kind of like look through what are some common attacks and what are some responses that bring in our framing, use some of these stats that tell a story, and kind of like incorporate some of these messaging elements to kind of have these like standard responses, which can be then used as like the framework for like things like, you know, spokespeople preparation, or even like social media posts, or even like replying to comments or replying conversation. So what we did was we tried to pull together some of the most common attacks or arguments that we feel kind of crop up again and again, and come up with some of these usable chunks of messaging which can be used in response. So we have a couple here, and again, you can see more in the guide. And also linked down here is what we're calling our cut and paste doc, which I'm gonna, again, Nathan, if you want to explain that quickly.
Yeah, so we're just kind of aware that sometimes we get caught behind the wave of current affairs and news. So we thought we'd have an organic document that we're constantly updating and adding to, that anyone in Animal Rebellion, whether that's PR, whether that's social media, anyone else can go to and find responses that reframe arguments kind of the way that we want it to be. So whether, yeah, there's a story in the news about less but better, we can kind of just go to this bank of kind of responses we have, and yeah, just kind of address it straight away rather than just letting it simmer and not having a word in it, and it just makes us a dominant voice in that conversation. We also have a lot of like press release filler script in there, so people aren't just typing out the same thing again and again when they're doing press releases, and also a lot of kind of collation of news articles that support our stories and support our narratives. And that's just going to continue to grow and grow. So whenever we want to say something or want to put something out, we have this massive bank of evidence, a massive bank of sources that we can use.
Amazing, thanks so much. And something else that we touched on in the guide is what the public thinks. So this is kind of doing some research into what we know about what the public actually thinks about the messaging that we're using, and about messaging around climate and animal justice in general. And we're also working at the moment on a testing project to try and test out some of these assumptions, and to get a better understanding of this. But this is based on kind of current research, mainly around environmental communication, but also around communication around kind of plant-based diets mainly, and the idea of shifting diet and food system change in general. So things that we've learned is that we have won the moral high ground. And what I mean by that is that people believe that plant-based diets are ethical, good for the environment, healthy, and socially acceptable. However, they're less convinced on things like practicality, costs, and enjoyment levels of this change. Something else that we learned, which is really interesting, is that the word plant-based in general is not currently fixed. And what that means is that the definition around it, or the public understanding of around it, is quite malleable or kind of shapeable. So you compare it with words like vegan and vegetarian, there's a very kind of set understanding of what those words mean, and there's a very kind of like common association with them. So what this means is that there is still the ability to shape what plant-based means and influence its associations, which stresses how important it is to keep linking it to this idea of food system change and keep using it and kind of expanding that meaning and definition. Something else that we learn is that we know people believe diet change is a personal choice, but what we lack is an understanding of thoughts on food system change. And this is something that we need to know more about, because what we know is that people have a lot kind of stronger support for radical changes than we might believe originally. Like there was kind of a survey that was done which showed that 90% of US adults agree that whether to eat animals or be vegetarian is a personal choice. However, 49% of those adults support a ban on factory farming, and 47% support a ban on slaughterhouses, which is, really big. So we know that kind of like these radical changes aren't so far away from people's minds as we might think they are. What we don't know is what they think about food system change. But what we do know as well is that the promotion of plant-based diets is currently not very favored as a tactic to address the climate crisis. However, this idea of a transition to a plant-based food system is not so much on the agenda. So this is something that we can kind of keep pushing and moving forward. Another thing is that people generally understand that climate change is a big, complex, and urgent problem. So we've won the fight on that. We're not really coming up against many climate deniers anymore. The strongly dominant narrative is that this is a big problem. It's happening now. It's urgent and needs action. However, one of the main barriers that we face is that people are really fatalistic about being able to tackle climate change as fast as needed. And this is what this circle saying people are doomers is all talking about, in that we need to be able to tackle that. We need to be able to make people feel that they can make change. And that's kind of like the core of why we lean into one part problem, two parts hope kind of messaging. Something else that comes up is that people do locate responsibility with big powers, but they also place a lot of blame on developing countries as they refer to them. And this is something that we need to tackle as well, because we may be able to get people to quickly agree that responsibility lies with the government and big business, yet we win nothing if we get stuck in this blame game. So whose fault is it? Because people may kind of switch to, yeah, it's the government's fault, but they may just as easily switch to, oh no, it's all another country's fault. And that's not the story that we want to be telling. So these are kind of information that we have and things that we can influence our messaging as well. And I'm going to pass to Adam to talk about our vision.
Well, yeah, following on from that, I guess the vision is one of the one of the most profound and also fun aspects of our messaging work. Like, as Harley said, it can be really hard for people to imagine things like plant-based food system when it doesn't already exist. And how do we communicate that? So obviously we sort of know what we want. We know we want justice for all. But it can be really hard to visualize that, even for us. So yeah, we've been doing field trips and things and seeing fun ways we can yeah, change our relationship with non-human animals as well as yeah, the natural world. But yeah, that's it. It's a great excuse for fun field trips and stuff. Staying on message, okay. Yeah, so this is more practical things. I don't think I'm doing it though. I think Harley's doing this one. But yeah, it's practical things and walkthroughs, that sort of thing. So yeah, I'll hand it straight back to Harley.
Yeah, so this is kind of like how we can use these elements that we talked about in the guide to then maintain this consistent messaging unity that we talked about earlier. So we'll just go over some kind of key things that we suggest. There's also some guidance for kind of platforms and communications, which we'll skim through as well. And yeah, more information is in this presentation, which will be sent out. I think the first thing is that we want to be connecting to core values. And this is kind of ties into this idea that people have all these competing stories in their head, but what they often share is kind of these core values. And we kind of have 3 values that we like to focus on. And those are freedom, justice, and hope. And justice and hope are 2 really fantastic ones because they unite a really wide variety of people, and they have the potential to motivate people for sustained action. And freedom as well, this idea that we all deserve to be free. And kind of moving on, going on with our values, which I'll just kind of keep going with. We also want to maintain our values as Animal Rebellion. So we have our 10 principles and values laid out beautifully here by the graphics team, which were also consulted on and updated and adjusted in 2021. So now we have these new beautiful ones. And we have to ask ourselves with every communication that we do, does this uphold our principles and values? Does these guide like everything that we do? And just like we'd never plan an action which would intentionally hurt someone, we'd never use threatening, aggressive, or insulting language, because as well as being against LPNVs, it's kind of just lazy messaging, and it's relying on shock value, whereas we prefer to kind of use these approaches that are tapping into people's values and what they hold true, and then allowing them to see how our messaging aligns with what they believe. So there's a section here on how we maintain nonviolence in our messaging. So I'd really recommend people to have a look through this if you're developing communications. This is specifically useful, I think, for social media and also outreach, both online and in person. So it's kind of, we ask this question of, is it violent? Is the messaging they're developing violent? So we have things that are yes. So things that, you know, actions that cause harm to another human or animal or to the planet deliberately and with intent. Also things that are intentionally blaming and shaming, things that are intentionally insulting, things like that. So it's not just kind of like physical violence, it's also things that are intended to cause harm. There's also things that are maybe violent, and this is about where it's important to think about context and also, you know, discuss and talk as a team. And then there's things that we know aren't violent, but maybe kind of perceived as violent. And I know there's a whole section in the cut and paste section, it's the cut and paste document on how to address kind of criticisms or concerns about things like nonviolent actions being aggressive or coercive. So I'd encourage you to check that out. Something that might come up, and I know this happened last year when the Kill the Bill protests at one point kind of turned a little bit violent, and it's happened as well with other actions in the past. And it's been the question of how do we show solidarity with these groups with also maintaining our nonviolent stance, because the reason we're nonviolent is to allow as many people as possible to get involved, but we also support all groups who are kind of trying to build a better world and a more just world. So an approach that we kind of encourage is this, and this has kind of been taken from examples used during the civil rights movement and previously. And the idea behind this is that it's kind of like a very simple method of developing a message that maintains our solidarity while also kind of expressing our nonviolence. So it starts with expressing our solidarity, showing that we stand with all groups fighting for a better world, connecting to the deeper issue. So rather than getting engaged in a kind of debate about tactics, instead connecting to what's really at stake, and that people are scared and angry and are reacting very kind of understandably to inaction, and that we need action and we need to talk about the actual problem, and then affirming our own nonviolence and saying that we are open for everyone. We will continue to peacefully protest until we see change, and we encourage people to join us. So that's kind of a useful thing. There's also something here on managing internal escalation, because sometimes when we're communicating, whether it's online or in person, it can be hard, it can be challenging. So there's just some guidelines there on how we can check in with each other, and how we can also check in with ourselves, to understand, is this a situation I should be putting myself in? Because even if you have like all your talking points, your script ready before you, sometimes a conversation, or replying online, or being on the phone to someone talking about this, it can just get it can be too much, or it can be too close to home. And it's important to recognize as well that sometimes the best thing that we can do is say, can someone else kind of take this over? I'm going to walk away. And also to take some time to just think and prepare before speaking. And that kind of brings us on to our platforms and style. And I'll pass back over to Adam for this.
Yeah, so here's some really specific stuff about posting and whatnot on our various platforms. I'm sure you all interacted with at some point. So first up, we got posting guidelines. These are very broad brush. It's just things like we post content made by Animal Rebellion teams as long as it's on message. We post our graphics or other graphics as long as they're on message, and then actions as long as they follow our P's and V's and messages, and then just general news stuff as long as it relates to our focuses, both animals and climate justice. Obviously nothing like, we don't post conspiracies or violent stuff, or engagement blaming and shaming. That's not us. And just things like trainings. If you're more interested in this side of thing, I'd recommend checking out the social media guide, which is newly released and is I think linked somewhere. We can probably put it in the chat. And then up next.
Or feel free to join the social media team as well.
I don't know why we divided it this way. It's it's so jumpy. Over to you.
Apologies. This is just some little tips on communication using these great animal friends who are communicating very well. We say stay polite. We don't always have to agree with people, but we do have to maintain nonviolence. And that includes our language. And again, kind of like, take a break if you need. That dog's very, very polite. So be like the dog. Listen first. Owls are great at listening. This kind of refers to both online and in person. And it also helps, like, you don't have to respond straight away. When we think about all this kind of communication theory that we're talking about, thinking about all the Animal Rebellion communication stuff that we know, it can help to take a minute to prepare what you're going to say anyway. And listening is a good way of doing that. Offer first, don't offer rather than argue. We want to kind of be attracting people who are either our base, so people who are already on board with our message and we're trying to mobilize them, or people who are kind of in the middle and are kind of unsure, who we can have a conversation with. But if someone's completely on the other side, it's sometimes just not worth our time to try and convince them. So we can offer that there's another way of seeing things, and there's another kind of frame and story that people can believe, but it's not worth kind of our energy to argue and try and convince. And yeah, take a step back, like that little signet. If things like, if you are thinking about how to communicate and aren't sure, or maybe it's just not the right kind of an area that you're comfortable with, it's okay to say, no, not for me, maybe next time. And that kind of leads us on to making mistakes. So some kind of quick things, and this kind of applies to anyone doing any kind of communication work. What we know is that we're always going to say something at some point that's going to not sit right with someone. And it can be so stressful to feel like, you know, oh no, I put out a social media post and now people are going off and are really upset with me, or oh no, you know, I put out a press release and it's gotten completely the wrong angle, they've gone and said completely the wrong thing, or misquoted me and I don't know what to do, or any other kind of communication thing, someone's misheard me, someone's misunderstood me. So the kind of recommendations we have is first take time, and again, taking a step back, recognizing that most likely it's not the end of the world to take an hour to kind of figure things out. Take action, so figure out what needs to be done. And this kind of also is, you know, if you have a team, like if you're working with a team, which at Animal Rebellion we all do, taking time and taking action is talking to your team, figuring out the best response, not doing it by yourself, and then taking care as well. So making sure you're not overwhelmed, making sure you have the support that you need. And I think, like, when we're talking about communication, like, it can seem very far removed, I think, from the action side of things. But, you know, like when you're communicating, like it's most of what we do is talking and sharing stories and communicating. And when the kind of, it feels like the stakes are high when it's talking, you know, communicating about something that's so important to everyone, to all of us, it can feel really, really stressful, that it's so important that people understand you, and so important that you get the right message across. So it's just, yeah, like the reality is, no matter how much thought we put into this, we're never really going to know how a message is going to land. Even something as simple as social media post, how that's going to land until it's out there, and until we are seeing how people are responding. So yeah, it's just important to recognize that, and to know that things aren't good, like things are gonna happen, and it's important to do these steps. And finally, I'll hand over to Adam again for the last time to talk us through some tips on style that we use in the Animal Rebellion media and messaging team, and that we kind of support and encourage people using when they're messaging on behalf of Animal Rebellion. Yeah.
Okay, I'm very conscious of the time. We're gunning down on half past, so fortunately this section is tiny. It is a single slide. If we can grab that up. Yeah, so this is sort of like, I guess, a rundown from the top messaging tips. These are really sort of easy things we can do, and we can all do when we create any sort of message. So yeah, it's never, McDonald's has been shut down. It's always, we shut down McDonald's. It's very important. Speak actively, you know, we know what we stand for, and we're proud of what we do. We don't want to remove our agency in it. Yeah, collective endeavor, we're in it together. Really important for obvious reasons. Hope-based, you've heard it all before, you know why you have to do it. Young and cheeky, yeah, that is really a style thing that has emerged. And we find just on a pragmatic sort of statistical level, we do a lot better when we have sort of fun and tongue-in-cheek content. And yeah, it brings a new angle to things. Often in this sort of sphere, it is yeah, very doom and gloom. Share the vision. Yeah, very important. We call people to action and get them involved in building a just and fair world. And then, yeah, lead with values. Super important. That's how we connect with people and how we're going to make lasting impact. Yeah, I hope it wasn't too speedy. But yeah, we are now 1 minute over. And
I don't actually think this was 1 hour. I think we allowed an hour.
Oh, really?
And a half, but, you know, we
generally
through it for everyone.
We're pretty strict normally.
Well, yeah, the end. So we'll stop there. And I'm gonna stop recording. But essentially, yeah, thank you so much for coming. The aim of this presentation is to give everyone the tools that they need to communicate on behalf or in alliance with Animal Rebellion. And this is something that's learning and growing and developing, and it kind of takes all of us to build this. So thanks for coming. Hope you got something out of it. And we'll be sending out the resources afterwards as well, so you can have a chance to read the guide, which is exciting, and go through the presentation again. And yeah, does anyone have any questions that they would like to ask now? Or else you're welcome to get in touch over email as well.